So before we get going here, while we're letting some people come in, we got 46 going up. I like exponential rise in numbers. Our next talk next month will be Judd Case. He's been studying some bison bones up in northern Idaho. He's a wonderful speaker as well. Eastern Washington's own Judd Case is next month, last Tuesday of the month. After that, in March, we'll have Erica Rader, who's coming from University of Idaho, and she's actually going to talk about some experiments, basaltic experiments, where she can measure the water content and figure out the viscosity changes in basalt, and then compare that to rocks on Mars. It's called SPLAT. It should be a great talk. I'm really looking forward to it. She's one of the newer members of University of Idaho's geology department. Then we'll have Reed Lewis, everybody's favorite Idaho geologist, come in towards the end of the seminar series. And we'll finish it with Joanna Redwine, who's an Interior Bureau of Reclamation geologist and did some really nice trench work in Oregon. So she'll share that. All right, kind of peeking here. Good. So we'll start to talk pretty quick here. During the talk, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A, and I'll try to answer some questions if I can here and there. This is the Columbia Basin Geologic Society and Eastern Washington University Geology Department. I'm Chad. Feel free to email me, Chad Pritchard, if you'd like to be put on the list. If you're not on the email list, we'd love to have you in more talks. We have great talks, especially tonight. As a professor, you get to meet some really neat people. And I have to say, even if I read the wonderful Jack Nisbet's biography, it doesn't say he's just a wonderful human being. It was just a pleasure to have Jack here tonight because he's just a great person. And he's going to talk about his new book, Dreamer and Doctors. And I listened to him talk about this a couple of times, and he's going to focus this time. And each time it was great. It was a wonderful talk. And this time he's going to focus on the geologic aspects of the history of the Leiberg family. There's other great books too. Visible Bones is one of my favorites. We actually used a class at Eastern Washington University on Visible Bones, which is one of Jack's, another great book. So yada, yada, I can talk forever, but everybody give a warm welcome to Jack Nisbet, and please put your questions in the question and answer, and we'll have a discussion at the end. Thank you, Jack. Are you ready?
I am ready, Chad.
Okay.
And I guess I have to start by thanking Chad and the EWU staff and the whole society, because I go to these talks. I'm not a geologist, but I have really learned from them. And it builds on how I came into the world of rocks. I came up to Stevens County a long time ago and with a mining family, and worked for various miners and prospectors for the next decade. And I had one of them who was hauling scrap at the time to support his prospecting habit. And he told me that he could read geological changes on the landscape just by looking at the surface vegetation. And that just drove me crazy. And I think that combined with the tribal oral histories I heard from Spokane and Kalispell elders that described the valley before the river was dredged really set me on the path for what I've been doing ever since. This is a picture of quartzite above Chewelah that really sort of loomed over a lot of this learning process. So I'm a writer, and I'm always trying to work that space between what lay people like me see in the rocks and what professional scientists see. Say, I'm looking at the history of the magnesite operation in Chewelah and helping to junk out the remains of it. And then I listened to a piece by Chad and Steve Box about the dates of these rocks and what a refined story it is. And I'm just really interested in how that plays out for the general public, how public history works, how public perception of geology works. And so I'm always looking for other people that allow me to write about that. And there's this guy, John Leiberg, who works. He just works. He was a Swedish, born and raised in Malmo, the port city in Sweden, and immigrated by himself when he was 15, ended up in the Midwest, always liked plants, which his dad, who was a sea captain, said was a total waste of time. And there's records of him attending meetings of the Davenport, Iowa Natural History Club in the 1870s, born in 1853 before the Civil War. So like many of these Scandinavian immigrants that are just such a big part of our region's story, he goes to the Midwest He marries another Swedish woman. He has kids. He's a pillar of the community. He works for a little railroad. And then he just chucks it all up and comes west. And the way he does it is on the Northern Pacific, which in 1883 finished laying the tracks to the coast. And he was aboard working for them. John Leiberg's job was to plant box elders through the prairies of western North Dakota and eastern Montana to make it look like there was going to be something you could do, because as soon as they laid the tracks, they started putting out these posters to attract settlers. And you can see in the three that are land-based, there's deciduous trees in them, which, as we know, there are not in western North Dakota and eastern Montana. And then the fourth one is a mining scene where you can see that there's light at both ends of the tunnel. So it makes it look sort of like a carnival ride, and it's going to be great. And again, we know that's not exactly true either. And this is just, I think Leiberg did this, but I think he sees some of the humor in it. And he goes back to the Minnesota Natural History Society in Minneapolis and does a talk after these train trips that he takes in 1883 planting box elders. And he doesn't talk about current plants. I mean, he collected plant specimens from the slopes of Mount Rainier that are in the Smithsonian Herbarium, but he does a talk about fossil leaves that he found in what is now Teddy Roosevelt Park on the North Dakota-Montana border, and sees ginkgo trees and Asian trees, but also southeastern deciduous trees, and he is intrigued by it. And he can turn a phrase in a kind of funny way. He sees all these homesteaders going broke out there, of course. It is a rather novel and strange arrangement that the settler upon these prairies should, in order to clear his farm, be obliged to pull the stumps of trees that flourished perhaps 50,000 years ago. And this is like the introduction to him struggling with geology. In deep time is a struggle for everybody, and it's the hardest thing to teach in a lot of ways to students. And so 50,000 isn't enough, but he's getting a feel for it. And he goes on in this paper to say, you know what? I'll bet you there was this rich deciduous forest because the weather could come on across from the Pacific, and then the Rocky Mountains and the Cascade rose up and blocked the weather system and dried it up. And so he understood in his way what theories wouldn't prove, and really until the 60s and 70s, 100 years later almost. So he has an intuitive way to read the landscape that really plays with the way I like to think about people on the landscape and public knowledge about geology. And it really works to our advantage in that his favorite part of the ride was everybody's favorite part of the ride, from Missoula to Spokane. And, the Rockies, starting at the Rockies and then coming down to Missoula and back up to Spokane. And he, in 1884, comes back, takes the railroad down to the Snake River, takes a steamer to Lewiston, buys a horse, and takes this great arc of a ride up through the Nez Perce Reservation up the Clearwater, across to the St. Joe and St. Mary's, and then up beside Lake Coeur d'Alene, Wiesner Peak and all that stuff in the Coeur d'Alenes, and down into the Silver Valley, and then up to Lake Pend Oreille, which he's seen from the train going over. And that is where he decides he's going to stake his claim. And he goes and puts a homestead claim in on what is now Farragut Park. So in this picture, you can see Bernard Peak on the left and Cape Horn and Bayview on the right, and Mount Spokane on the right with the ski hill and Mica Peak on the left. That's where the Ice Age floods come out, as we all think of it now. But he's homesteading in the flat in between. And it's not just him. He has brought a woman who is not his wife, and a kid who may or may not be his son. And they do it together. The child's name is Bernard, and that's why it's Bernard Peak today. His fingerprints are all over the names of this part of the Coeur d'Alene. And his wife's name is Carrie Marvin, and she's a physician, and she is a whole world in herself that we won't talk about much tonight, but she's somebody else. And they have this little cabin right looking out at, Bernard and the Green Monarchs and where the ice anchored. And it's a beautiful place. It still is a beautiful place. You can see fruit trees that they planted. The sports of those are still growing out at the end of the point. And as you can see from this map, it was called Leiberg Point at that time. Leiberg is coming here to mine. And he had checked out all these places when he took his horse trip, and he'd found this little drainage that was not on any maps yet, the little North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene. He created a trail from Athol over the Chilco Saddle down into the North Fork, an easy drive today, steep country. And over the next 20 years, he and Carey together made about 36 claims there and did all kinds of work on it. That's just fascinating work, and it's nicely documented, and it again, it's the story of our settlement here, and it's just how prospectors work. He went up to the Priest, he went out over to the Coeur d'Alenes, he went down to the Wallowas to do claims, but he had a home turf here in the little North Fork that he could really work. And he always thought he was going to come in, that next year these were going to come in and he was going to be able to sell them. So in 1883, when he came across, there were the big gold strikes in Pritchard on the North Fork. At this time, when he starts doing it, it's more lead, zinc, and silver from the Silver Valley kinds of deposits. But there's just huge mining activity, and he's just on the periphery of it, trying to figure out the geology so he can capitalize on it. But Leiberg never does just one thing. He's also still loving his plants. And you can actually make money sending plant specimens back to herbariums in the East, things like calypsos that are beautiful orchids growing around in the wet country of the Coeur d'Alenes, and endemics like Idaho gold thread that blooms right after the snow goes away. And he just starts sending out correspondence because the train has connected this world back east on a very sophisticated level. And his letters reached the attention of this woman named Elizabeth Britton, who's one of the founders of the New York Botanical Garden. She is a powerhouse, and she mentors him around as they figure out that there's all these mosses in North Idaho that don't grow anywhere else and have not been identified yet. And they just have all these adventures doing that. And he sends all these letters that combine the rocks that are around him, the geology that is around him, with these endemic mosses. This is this Alcea moss that grows like hairs in specialty rock situations. And this is a letter to Elizabeth that's about 20 pages long. It grew like this, hanging in long, soft festoons from the underside of the shelving rock. And the shelving rock has been disturbed by the ice, by the Cordilleran Glacier that's anchored there in the Green Monarchs where he finds this. It's really hard. It's really hard not to be excited because of the way he does it. He's so into it. But again, he's still talking about mining. And he finds out that Elizabeth's husband is a geology teacher at Columbia University. Elizabeth can't teach there because she's a woman. So her husband teaches the botany courses too. And one of his cohorts in the geology department is John Strong Newberry, who is a legend of Northwest geography and geology because he did the 1854 railroad survey from the Dalles down to the Klamath country looking for a railroad route over the Cascades in Oregon. And he wrote an amazing report that has rocks in it. He's a geologist first, but it includes the rest, the ecology of what's going on. Really a big time person. And Leiberg doesn't think that the local assayers know enough about rocks. So he keeps sending boxes of rocks on the train back to his Elizabeth and telling her to hand them off to Dr. Newberry because he just needs to know. He won't be able to figure out the geology until he gets some professional help. I associate with that. So he tells her all these things that he is doing. It's fun. And he goes up to the real scree, the tailless parts of, this is Wiesner Peak looking north to Latour Baldy and St. Joe Baldy, all those places. He sees that the wind is sweeping the snow off of him in the winter, so he snowshoes up there to look for mosses and lichens. But then he goes, well, why is all this scree here? They aren't that tall in altitude. Why are the plants like they are? Why are the rocks like they are? He keeps getting fumbled up in that and keeps trying to think of a way to make money on it, and he keeps telling Elizabeth how hard he's working and how he's figuring the geology out. And his wife is always telling him it doesn't make any difference. It is a fact that by far the great majority of rich and important mineral discoveries out here in the West have been made by the scum and outscourings of the earth, saloon sorts and all sorts of riffraff. My wife says that's because the majority of the prospectors are composed of that class of men, and I presume she is right, which I love from the people I worked with back in the day in the Colville Valley. They would love this quote because they all thought of themselves like that, I believe. So he gets up here and he's very proud of the way he has learned to explore on the ground in a minor sense as opposed to a botanist sense. There are different ways to explore a country. There is as wide a difference between the way in which official explorations are carried on and the way a prospector examines the country as there is between night and day. A prospector's life is a dog's life, but oh, the knowledge one gains of the mountains. He thinks he is as good in this country as anybody, and that his legs are better than anybody, than any of these posts that come from Washington, D.C. to do their plant lists or mammal lists or bird lists, which is happening now. He thinks he's better than them because he has a more broad view, and it's the geology that's done it for him. And he also tells Elizabeth all these other wonderful things. That his neighbors, there's a Kalispell winter village near where Bayview is now that's still operating in the 1880s, and they're driving deer down into the lake and clubbing them over the head, and he thinks it's barbaric, but they've been doing it for thousands of years. It's amazing what he sees and what he picks up on. He talks a lot about fire. He is outraged that the prospectors, including himself, in real steep, heavily wooded country will just torch off an outcrop that they see so they can explore it better. And so it's smoky all summer. The trains that are coming through put off sparks from the steam engines. The farmers are burning off their slash when they're trying to do arable ground. So their fires are a real problem. And in one dry year, 1889, they get so bad, they drive him off his claims. And then, as we know, they burn Spokane. So in a letter to Elizabeth Leiberg, he just writes, took the train into Spokane today to see the great conflagration. It's a mess. And Carey is a doctor at this time, knowing what's going on and running a practice in the middle of all this. The following winter, there are big avalanches and that bury a couple of mining camps in the Silver Valley because of the way the mining practices that have been going on. And Leiberg writes to Britain, they are reaping now what they have been sowing for many years. He has no sympathy at all for them because they aren't paying attention to the soil and to the forest and to what is the overburden on the rocks, that they have to be more careful with the water resources and how the water flows across the landscape and with the way that they attack it. And he tries to get the other prospectors that are in the little North Fork with him to be more careful with fire especially. He's learning how it sterilizes the soil. He's learning how runoff is changed completely. He's really trying to study this out. And in fact, in these years, in the 1890s on into the early 90s, the economic situation really starts to decline. The price of silver plunges. It really helps a lot to lead to this terrible economic depression called the Panic of 1893. And he sees mining as not the way to make a living anymore. Carey is the one that's carrying the mail for the family. She goes to Hope, which is a section station for the Northern Pacific on the top end of Lake Pend Oreille, and she opens a practice, and she has her own letterhead stamp made up, and she's making money. And Leiberg decides to try to go a different route too. He goes back working for the railroad and goes to Hamilton, Montana, and spends the winter of 1892-93 trying to explore for a new route over the Bitterroots. Everywhere he goes, he's learning the country, learning the geology more. And in 1893, through the connections with Elizabeth Britton, she contacts Frederick Coville, who's 26 years old and has just been named head of what will be the National Herbarium at the Smithsonian. Big time job. And he's sending out seasonal workers to do plant surveys, just like you would do for the Forest Service or the USGS, a seasonal summer worker. And Coville, who's 26, hires Leiberg, who is 40, to be on one of these expeditions. And Leiberg is the junior partner. He wrangles the animals. He takes care of the feed. He runs the camp. But the person who's in charge, whose name is Dr. Sandberg from Minneapolis, has a bad leg. So Leiberg ends up collecting all the plants as well, and also keeping this amazing journal of the whole summer. And Colville is a bit of a mountain climber, and he tells them that what he wants to know is he wants them to start in Spokane, go across the basin, figure out where the pine trees are and the sagebrush are, because nobody's ever done that, to look at the limits of the desert, what they call it the Great Columbia Desert at the time, and then to go up into the Cascades and clock the changes in the plants, and then to climb some of these peaks in the Cascades while they're at it. They've got the whole summer to do this, and they just have an amazing trip. And Leiberg goes out and he's keeping the journals, so there's all kinds of little things that he sees. He pitches his first camp at Hangman Creek. He goes up to where the golf course is now, about 6 miles upstream from the mouth. He sees the amazing rhythmites that the geologists now use to try to count the Ice Age floods in, and ties himself in knots trying to understand Miocene basalt flows combined with Latah clays interspaced into them, combined with the Ice Age floods that come and just tear this up and bring in all these other elements. And he does a reasonable job, actually, for the most part. He does a reasonable job. And he makes a killer plant list that can be used today by anybody that's trying to do any restoration on Hangman Creek, on Lower Hangman Creek, which, as most of you know, is an area of real interest at this point. Then he takes off and goes to Medical Lake. He goes on down and makes another camp and takes a side trip to Rock Creek. He's a talker. He talks to all the homesteaders to see how they're doing on the land. He notes that there's got to be some kind of huge flood that went through this, that created everything. The depressions and the lava flows all show powerful eroding actions headed in the same direction. The farmers, of course, are trying to take advantage of this, and it's working against them some of the time. They're trying to drain wetlands, and they lose the water then. When no natural outlets exist, water from the shallower ponds is carried by blasting ditches through the interposing narrow basaltic knolls and dikes. I mean, it's just, he's traveling the Cheney-Palouse scablands the way that somebody trying to live off the land would in all the places we go walk, down at Fish Trap Lake or Turnbull. And the settlers are often hurting themselves with the way they're trying to capture the water. It makes them lose it. And he sees the pine trees fingering down into the desert and into the sagebrush and then dropping out entirely. He comes across Harrington, Odessa. It's just a great trip. And he takes a side journey up into the alkali lakes of Lower Grand Coulee. And now he's really starting to get his mind altered by how much bigger the water event seems to be here. A huge fissure in the basalt running north and south. The whole plain seems to have been sharply cut off to a depth of 1,000 feet or more. Then he gets back on his main track on Crab Creek and comes out below Soap Lake to the Ephrata Fan. Crossing Crab Creek, we emerged on a plain covered with boulder drift. The boulders of very large dimensions and the drift composed of basalt and granite. It appears to have come directly through the great fissure in which lie the alkali lakes previously noticed. So again, he's following this water, and the water just goes and goes and goes. The scale of what is happening is beginning to sort of sink into his mind. It's hard not to think of Harlan Bretz when this is going on, especially when he does something like seeing these big boulders at the top of the Ephrata Fan. He goes off his track and follows them south all the way to Moses Lake, where the grain size gets smaller and smaller and smaller until finally it's just an endless series of sand dunes when there's no natural outlet to the lake, and behind what is now O'Sullivan Dam in the Potlatch Reservoir. So he's feeling it. He is feeling the geology across the basin in a way that Harlan Bretz would do and put numbers on 3 decades later. It's pretty amazing that nobody else is doing it, but I can't find anybody that's writing about it in this way before Bretz. So he comes and crosses the Columbia at West Bar, down and near Trinidad, and then sees all these orchards cranking up in the Wenatchee, sees the change from basalt to more metamorphic rocks and granites, and then goes all the way to Stevens Pass. He can't climb any of the peaks there because they're too steep. He thinks about Glacier Peak. What am I going to do? He comes back to Mount Stewart because it's so prominent, but it's sticking out to the east a little bit. He figures out a way to get up it. And he climbs Mount Stewart in 1893. That's 2 years before the USGS sent an official team up there to put the cap in. And I mean, he's the guy. And he's up there looking for plants. And again, he sees the geology changing the way that they work. A feature of this mountain, which is of granitic origin, are the numerous dikes of serpentine traversing it from north to south. These dikes have a quite peculiar flora, essentially different from that of the granites surrounding them. And again, his plant list is a thing of beauty from Mount Stewart. During these few days, he's on there, late summer 1893. Then he goes back to Hope, where Carrie is staying with Bernard, because Bernard's about to start school, and they have two places, their homestead and their other place. Across the railroad tracks from Carrie's office in Hope are these astonishing petroglyphs, the famous bear paw petroglyphs, very near David Thompson's trade house that he built in 1812. And John Leiberg, again, this is a combination of geology and botany. He looks at the rock-loving lichens that are growing across them and realizes they're of amazingly great age because these are really slow-growing lichens. He writes a paper that's published in Science that same summer. It's waiting for him to get home. In the summer of 1893, it's the first paper written about these petroglyphs. And he tries to describe them. And again, he ties himself in knots trying to understand the rocks, the belt rocks. The rock is a highly siliceous magnesium schist, extremely hard and difficult to chisel with even the most carefully tempered modern steel tools. He's very proud of this toolkit he's made for his prospecting, and he can't touch this rock. And here's these people that are probably thousands of years ago that have made these beautiful pieces of art into it. And he realizes that it must be some kind of erosive technique with grit and water and time that these very patient people have carved these bear paws in. And he's impressed. His world is growing larger from looking at the rocks and growing outward from it. Frederick Colville likes what Leiberg does. He doesn't hire Dr. Sandberg anymore and lets Leiberg go by himself. The next summer, he's going to do the same thing in Eastern Oregon. And Leiberg takes the train to Heppner and starts off. He's very excited because Colville has told him about Crater Lake and how great it's going to be. And he isn't out 2 days before he runs into a bunch of Umatilla women digging cows, Lomatium cows, Indian biscuit root for food in these very rocky lithosols. And Leiberg has been fascinated the way these parsley family umbellifers grow all over the Columbia Basin, all over the rocky rocks, and thrive on it starting super early in the year and then sweeping across and going all the way up into the mountains. He's identified one up at the top of Pack Saddle, this called Sandberg's biscuit root that he gave to his partner from the previous year, and he took the name of it. And Lewis and Clark have a lot of writings about this root and how the Indians use it and the cakes they make of it and everything. Leiberg sends some of them back, and while he's doing it, he realizes that it's not just cows that they're using. This is a photograph from Fish Trap last February, late February, early March, of these little tiny biscuit roots called salt and pepper flooding over a lithosol. There are millions of them at Fish Trap, Turnbull, all the parks in Spokane. Some of them the leaves are out already this year because it hasn't been a very cold winter. And they have a nutritive bulb, a little hazelnut-sized corm that's on the bottom tuber that is a cultural plant. This is the pukpuk and tukum that the Spokanes eat. that they gather all over the Swanson Lakes and the Twin Lakes area, Coffee Pot Lake down in that, and where their range meets the Wanapum gathering places around Soap Lake in Grand Coulee. And Leiberg knows that these are part of the world, and they're growing in different kinds of rocks, different kinds of lithosols. Then he goes down to the Snake and sees salmon-flowered biscuit root and Gray's biscuit root growing right at the base of talus slopes in slightly different basalt situations. Right after he sees the Umatilla people digging, he starts seeing this new biscuit root that's unidentified that we now call John Day biscuit root growing in the rock streams up above. You can see it up above Route 97 around Madras if you go east and go up high and just look for rock streams. But you have to go right early in late March, early April, and then it's gone. It is an amazing plant. And Leiberg sees this as kind of the key and the main distinctive feature of the flora of the Columbia Basin, but it's connected to the rocks. And that all comes together in his mind when he spends several weeks on the east slopes of the Paulina down into some really harsh desert around Button Springs, and then circles back up to Bend and down to Paulina Creek and comes up, goes to the Great Caldera, climbs Paulina Peak so he can look down on it, and then walks the rim all the way around. And he's just realizes that this is the real thing. I mean, he gets up on Paulina Peak and says a prominent elevation overlooks a wilderness of gigantic monuments of the great fires that once raged in this crater and flung out masses of pumice stone that cover many leagues of eastern Oregon. The present distribution and character of the flora of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington is most intimately connected with the recent geological history of this region and cannot be fully unraveled until the changes that have taken place since the beginning of the great basaltic metamorphosis are more fully understood. So again, the concepts of deep time that we have now, where we understand that the Miocene is 17 million years ago and that the floods are 17,000 years ago, Leiberg has trouble with that, but he knows that that is the key to understanding the place, is the interaction between those events, those cataclysmic geologic events. And Paulina is where he really gets a hold of it. He goes on to crater. I mean, remember that when they decided, when they were doing national parks, they had to choose between Crater and Paulina. Either one is a great choice, but Paulina still today is something else. And it's really educated Leiberg. So Frederick Colville loves the report he sends in this year, and he gives him a third summer in the Coeur d'Alene Basin. And because the world of timber is coming on, they're starting to think about these forest reserves. And Gifford Pinchot is coming on the scene. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be president in 5 years, and they're going to try to create the Forest Service as we know it today. So Colville says this summer, you have to explore all the waters that drain into Lake Coeur d'Alene, and then you have to do your plant survey, but you also have to figure out all the timber that's growing in there and the mining and try to understand how it fits into that. And Leiberg's all for it. And he does an amazing way of attacking it that you could only do this if you really knew the territory. He takes the train to Rockford, out of Spokane, gets his wagon, goes down through Rockford, goes on the Coeur d'Alene res, and then comes up into the Palouse, into the St. Mary's, across to the St. Joe's, and then down into the Wiesner Peak area, explores that more, comes down to the Mission and out to Stevens Peak, climbs Stevens Peak, gets a taste of how the Bitterroot worked, because he's real interested in the Bitterroot, then goes and across the North Fork and climbs Sunset Peak so he can get a taste of all these the old gold diggings. And then he comes back up the Silver Valley. And what he sees just really disturbs him, because again, he made a trip very similar to this in 1884. It's 11 years later, and it has changed a lot. Then he comes down the Silver Valley and goes up the Little North Fork, the North Fork and the Little North Fork, and goes back to his homestead, gets on a steamboat, goes to Hope, where Carrie's office is, puts a rowboat on a train and takes it upstream to Plains, Montana, takes the boat out, floats the Clark Fork back to Hope, spending a day going up each drainage till he gets to the divide so that he can look down on these North Fork situations and get his plant list in order. It's brilliant. And the stuff he sees is amazing. This is the famous S trestle down in the St. Joe in 1894 by a Northern Pacific photographer. And you can see the trains put out sparks and they burn everything. That's just how it works. And he is outraged by the waste of resources, of the timber resources. He's all for mining. I mean, he's a miner, but then he comes to the Silver Valley and he is outraged by the way that they are treating the water, which he knows is the key to power the mining processes of concentration, and also the key to having a healthy place where people can live and trees can grow. So he gets there and watches the water go through the concentrators of the mines. After it is used, the water is, of course, returned to the river channel. It is then heavily charged with the siliceous slimes derived from the crushed gangue of the ore and more or less of the metallic elements which the concentrating machinery failed to save, such as the sulfides of lead, iron, antimony, zinc, and arsenic in various combinations. The color of the slime-laden water is a dirty gray, and the particles held in suspension are deposited along its course. After passing through these establishments, the water is unfit for either drinking or irrigation purposes. So this is 130 years ago. We're still trying to figure this out. And all he wants is for people to pay attention and to think about the long-term effects of what they're doing. That's how geology works. That's what you take from geology, is that long view. Colville loves that report because he does a great job on the timber in that especially. And he assigns him, and so he doesn't assign him. What he does is he trades him straight across to the USGS, which is in charge of doing these forest reserve surveys. And in 1897, Leiberg's summer job, which starts in the spring and ends late in the fall, is to look at the Priest River Forest Reserve and do the same kind of work where you look at everything and you look at people on the landscape. And it's not the largest of the reserves, but it has the most concentrated, rich timber resources. So they really wanted to get into it. He meets Gifford Pinchot and Coolin in the summer of 1897, and they start a talk strategy. And you can see Leiberg's influence on the Forest Service today and how we manage and divide up our forests. He's the one that told Gifford Pinchot that you should include the Bonners Ferry side of this reserve into the national forest because that was important. You should take the state land and the government, national government land, and divide them up so that the state owns the east side of Priest, and the Forest Service, what would become the Forest Service, would own the west side, which is the way it worked. Leiberg's advice was taken by Gifford Pinchot after he became head of the Forest Service several years later. So this is everything's in the air for the era of Teddy Roosevelt and conservation and trying to get, public land to use in a comprehensible way. And Leiberg's trying to help them. And he has a camera. He has an extra horse with a tripod and glass plates. He takes some killer pictures of, this is the Priest River Divide looking west. I mean, it's a real educational experience for foresters today, or geologists for that matter, who want to see what it was like 130 years ago. And he takes a lot of pictures of burned, wasted white pine. There's a lot of pictures of it in there. So what he sees is so clear to him. He sees that the east side, what he calls the Priest River Divide, is the loftier. Its rock formation consists of hard but much fissured granites and syenites with occasional areas of slate and gneisses along the southern extremity. And it's really cut up and it's really steep. It's really harsh. Again, it's one of the most desired places you can get now. Whereas right across the narrow lake, it's totally different. It's rounded. The geology is softer. You're on the Washington side now. It has some incredibly lush soils, incredibly big cedars, disjunct plants like wild cranberries and red flowering currant that you should only see on the coast. He is mesmerized by it. And he realizes that a lot of it has to do with ancient beaver work. The marshy flats or meadows occurring in the western half of the reserve are often the result of beaver dams constructed ages ago. The fertility of the soil resides largely in the superficial layer of mold and humus. And this is Bismarck Meadows, which still looks just like this. And he describes how fragile it is and how you have to pay attention. You have to be careful. That's his constant refrain. He does a good job there. George Gannett, Quad Gannett, who invented the quad map system, is the head of the USGS, and he hires him to go at the tail end of that, like fall of 97, to get into the Bitterroot, which is the largest of the forest reserve because it includes not only what we call the Bitterroot today, it includes the entire Clearwater, which is gigantic, 4 million acres. And Leiberg goes into that. And again, he spent a whole winter, a whole season in Hamilton for the railroad exploring the passes. So he goes up the 3 traditional tribal passes, Lolo Pass, Lost Horse Pass, and Nez Perce Pass on the Bitterroot Bridge. And then he works his way down one side and down the other. He takes his camera back so he can look down into the Clearwater area and think about how this twisting complex thing works, how the weather works in it. He talks to all the old prospectors and all the old trappers and lots of tribal people to try to get a feel of it. And then he sees that there's lots of these disjunct plants there too. This is Pacific dogwood that only grows on the coast, but this is growing on the Selkirk. What is going on? What is different about the weather and the geology of this that allows these plants from the coast to show up here? He goes up on the ridge and takes this astonishing picture of a Nez Perce encampment, an encampment at Nez Perce Pass that has 3 different language families of tribal people there: Nez Perce, Shoshone, and Salish, Bitterroot Salish. And he talks to the elders that were in the camp there, trades some roots with them, and thinks about the ridge and how it works. And to me, this is when he really sort of is working at his peak efficiency. He looks down on the Bitterroot side, and there, of course, are all these huge ponderosa pines, which they're logging like crazy by the 1890s out of Hamilton, and sees, he's measuring them in board feet per acre. He's acting like a forester here. But he also has his plant list, and he's also looking at what makes them. And he's also looking at the entire Bitterroot Valley and what makes it and the shape of it. And he's remembering back to how the Bitterroot hits the Clark Fork when he left out of Plains and saw the Camas Valley in Montana and Horse Plains, David Thompson's Horse Plains, saw these giant ripple marks marching across them. Then he thinks about the delta of the Clark Fork River into Lake Pend Oreille, where he has been gathering mosses. He sends letters to Elizabeth Britton about thousands of logs just jammed up in old channels that the river has abandoned, and the mosses that just cover them. So he's just eating all this up. Packsaddle Peak is the totem peak above his homestead, where he can look right down on his homestead. There's Leiberg Point in the way. There's the famous Y avalanche on Bernard Peak, and there's Cape Horn on the right. Again, Mount Spokane and Mica Peak. So when he's up there, he can see the whole thing as he turns around in circles. And it allows him to see that he has been traveling the route of something large that is different. And he theorizes that there must be a glacial lake that filled it all up at one time. It appears to have been a depression holding a lake, or rather an arm of a much larger lake, lying to the northward, which covered to a large extent the present head of the Clark Fork of the Columbia River Basin. The existence of the lake was probably due to a blocking of the valley trough of Clark's Fork by ice masses sliding into it from the adjacent mountains. When the glacier barriers were removed, drainage of the lake occurred. So he is spot on all of that from Pardee's work, except he doesn't understand continental glaciers, the Cordilleran Glacier that's coming down, the Purcell lobe that is blocking the lake. He thinks they have to slide off the mountains, which is what he saw at Priest. That's how he visualized how Priest was formed. But he's so excited he can hardly contain himself because he's seeing these large, deep time processes processes and how they would shape the landscape that he lived in. Now, George Gannon and Frederick Coville, they didn't stop on this. They sent Leiberg all over the place, all over the West, to the most important forests, like the Southern Oregon, really rich in timber. He does the Siskiyous, he does the Ashland, he does the gold country of California and the ones around Los Angeles. They sent him down to the San Franciscos, which is where John Muir and Gifford Pinchot worked, and where Teddy visited, and where Aldo Leopold was the first ranger. John Leiberg's the person who, before all that happened, did the survey of the proposed forest reserve. Now, he always talks about how local knowledge is key to doing a good job on this, and he's always seeking out local guides, talking to tribal people, et cetera. But the more work he does for the Forest Service, the coarser his reports get. It's only natural. He just has to crank them out. And the basis of his really good work, he also works in Montana at the Absarokas and Little Belt in the Yellowstone world. The real core of his work is North Idaho leaking into Western Montana and Eastern Washington. That's where he really understood it was the basis of his home ground, and he could just absorb all that. So in his world, Leiberg Point, as the center of the universe, was building on something big. Well, now we call it Eucalyptus Point because it's where the flood came out, and he would just be thrilled at that. And he would be thrilled at the way the general public has absorbed this Ice Age flood story that geologists continue to refine and explain in all these wonderful ways. And what he would like is for these other stories to come out, the terrains docking into each other, the way the basalt flows came, the disjunct plants, the way the mountains rose up and changed the world. He's all ready for all that. It's like he's visualizing where we are right now and asking us what we would do with it. So thank you very much for having me say that.
I'm sure all the 90 to 100 people are listening right now are applauding. Yes, that was great. Oh, man. So it's all in this book. I got this for my wife for Christmas, and she has not to read it yet, but I'm looking forward to this Dreamers. So we have one question on here so far, and I'm looking forward to some more, hopefully, from Parat, Miss Parat. Hello, Jack. I'm curious about Leiberg's relationship and view to local tribes he may have encountered during his expedition. And you did you talked quite a bit about this here and there, but would you like to add anything more about?
He's like a lot of people. He totally dismisses them at first. And he calls the Kalispel that are driving deer down into the lake. He thinks that's a very barbaric practice, and he tries to talk them out of it. But as he goes along and sees the subtlety which they deal with the flora and can move across the landscape, he gains a huge amount of respect for them, to where when he's looking at the petroglyphs, he never asks, as far as I can tell, any Kalispel, they didn't talk to him about what might have been going on with them. He treats them as a industrial problem, but when he's up in the Bitterroot, he's going in the teepees and talking to the elders and trading plants. And I think the best way to think about it is Frederick Coville comes out and joins him in 1896, and he does a second trip to Paulina and Crater Lakes and down to the Klamath. And it's yellow pond lily harvesting time on the Klamath when they go down there. And Leiberg introduces Coville to some of the elders that he met the 2 years previous. And Coville publishes a ethnobotanical list in Klamath, which is an extinct language, that has 100 plants on it almost. That's the kind of knowledge you could get then that you cannot get now, and it's preserved. And so I see that as him growing into the landscape. And when you grow into the landscape here, whether you're a geologist or a botanist or a wildlife biologist, whatever, you get more respect for the tribes and want more of the kind of information that they had, because it is how it works. You see more clearly how it works. So I wish he did more. The answer is I wish he did more, but he did some really interesting things with them, especially around biscuit roots, which is one of the many people did not get how complicated biscuit roots were. He did. Oh, I lost your sound somehow, Chad.
Oh, I muted myself to be.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. So yeah, no. At least you got the conservation right there too.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Folks early. Carol, if you could answer or type your question a little bit more there, we can get some more. But the next question on there is from a wonderful EWU geology student, Chris Halter. And he's wondering, how do you go about getting this information? Where do you start doing some of this research?
So this is a way a lot of my work happens. Is 25 or 30 years ago, the woman who ran the Sandpoint Museum said, "Hey, there's this woman doctor who's around here. You should look into see what she was doing. Her husband was some kind of botanist. You should check him out." And people tell me things all the time, and I don't know what to listen to, so I ignored her. And then Steve Arno, a fire ecologist over in the Bitterroot, I met him a long time ago, and he said, "Leiberg is really doing these things. You should pay attention to him." And then Art Zach was a Forest Service silvicologist on the Coeur d'Alenes, and he used his reports. He used Leiberg's reports to think about what the forest used to look like. And then a backcountry ranger from the Selway Bitterroot, Sarah Walker, who lives in Moscow, she had done some research on him. And so I slowly met all these people, and then found out that he had a bunch of letters to Elizabeth Britton and to Frederick Covell. And he writes these reports, which are government papers, which are like reports, and they're interesting and fun. But when I got into, my wife and I went back to DC and read hundreds of letters back to Covell, and it just makes you see him much more as a person. And Carrie slipped some letters in there too. We would know nothing about Carrie without these letters that she wrote to Elizabeth Britton. So that expanded enough. So then I could say, okay, maybe we can write a book about it. A lot of things have to fall right to make a book. And my wife, Claire, didn't think he was funny enough to write a book about, because humor is always a big thing in it. But then you start looking in these letters, he's got this very dry sense of humor when he's talking about the scum and outscourings of the earth, that's what prospectors like himself are. You go, yeah, I can deal with that. I can deal with scum and outscourings of the earth.
You got to question some of those people. Spelling Pritchard without a T, I don't know. I'm just joking.
We were going to ask you whether Pritchard had anything to do with the gold strikes or with the piece of land on Hangman Creek that's up for sale.
No, I wish. That was good. So yes, the book is great. A question from Ab Glaza. In the book, you mentioned Leiberg's crossing of the paths with Ronald McDonald, who seemed to have his own storied history, and is honored with Washington's smallest state park. I'm curious if that was a teaser of a story to come.
It wasn't Leiberg, it was David Douglas that crossed paths with Ronald McDonald. And I wish it was. There's been some pretty good books written about Ronald McDonald. And I think that I'm going to look at those books again. And I wish he did more in the Northwest. His real adventures were in Japan. Rounds were. His dad, Archibald McDonald, is somebody who we've looked at. But I guess at this point, when I'm doing something, it has to have women in it, and it has to have tribes in it, or it's not going to work for me. And Archie had all these people had tribal wives, or all of them, that are in the early time. And so you have to be able to find your way back into that oral history of the tribes and make a connection there for it to work.
Okay. Where is that? Do you know where the smallest state park is? I feel like
it's right up above. If you go from Curlew north to the border, Reynolds Grave is there. It's a great place. It's a great place.
I'll check it out.
No, yeah.
So the next question is, do we know if Harlan Bretz knew about Leiberg's ideas about the park?
Now, there's a great question. And that's a great question. And I don't think he did. I have no evidence that he did. I think that anybody who is out in the Cheney-Palouse scablands looking around, these question marks are going to come up in their head, and they're going to start looking. And Leiberg was the kind of guy who kept looking and started trying to put things together. And Harlan Bretz was the next stage of obsessiveness, and he had the technical background that he could really lay it out. It is astonishing that nobody had really tackled it seriously before him, to me. But there's really only one biography of him out, and it certainly doesn't mention Leiberg. But these government reports, the report on the Bitterroot, that has him conjecturing about the lake, that was the last piece of evidence, for that Pardee gave to Bretz. That was in a government report available for anybody to read, and quite obviously happening, where you could go up to Horse Plains. He describes all these flood features in Horse Plains and Camas Prairie and that. So I don't think so. I think he had to reinvent the wheel, as many geologists have done over time. They had to just start from scratch and do it himself.
That's actually really interesting, because Vic Baker has a nice little story about how Brett's actually talked to some of the high school professors back at
yes.
Clark. And so I wonder if maybe those guys.
This high school professor in Spokane that I have a couple maps of that was doing that. Yeah, I'd like to.
They have a couple of kind of very interesting papers. Yeah. Not quite as interesting as that petroglyph picture. I'd like to give it a science paper. Well, our next question here is, Jack, fabulous talk as usual. Why did the Leibergs split the Priest River area between the federal government and the state of Idaho on the east side there?
Because they had already, and this is addressed in Chris Smith's has a really great book, Wild Place, about the history of Priest Lake. And Chris Smith is a person who's lived there for 4 generations at Priest, but is actually a history professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And she went back to DC and found all the same things that Claire and I found. And we've shared materials. And she has a great section on that in the book, Wild Places, A History of Priest Lake. But basically, they had already started the concept of the state is going to get some of these sections for their timber to support their schools, and they're going to be checkerboarded all over the place and hard to manage. And if you trade them all up and then they're one place, then it's easier to figure them out. So it has to do with the GLO in 1897 is the one that went up Coeur d'Alene and Priest Lake. And that had a huge impact on the Leiberg's life. So they were well aware of it. And that's probably why they were thinking of it, why he was thinking of how unwieldy the system was and how it could be streamlined for a place that had as much valuable timber on it as Priest did. And if you go to Roosevelt Grove, now I really recommend that for anybody that's interested in his work on Priest or any place. Roosevelt Grove is truly an amazing cedar grove. I mean, there's lots of really great ones here, but Roosevelt is truly an amazing one, and it's on the west side of Priest rather than the east side. You can see some of what Leiberg's thinking was. It has to do with the beavers and the dams and the fertile soil and the rounded hills to some extent.
Fascinating. Yeah, this is whole. I love the names too and everything. So Laura's asking, in Farragut Park is the Leiberg's cabin. Do you know when that was built? What year? Or
yeah, we know all about that, and we have because again, it comes back to this GLO survey. There was a great Norwegian surveyor who had been working down the Boise Basin in the summer of '97. He went up to do Priest and that Pend Oreille areas with the crew, and he had Norwegians with him. They were specialty crew, and the Leibergs had worked since 1885 on this homestead, 12 years, and they didn't know whether it was on Northern Pacific land or on the alternate checkerboard. So they could have lost their whole place if it had been a 50-50 chance that they're going to lose their whole place. So this surveyor comes through, and he has 2 notebooks, one with the survey information in it, and then he has comments. And John, of course, is gone because he's always gone, and Carrie's there, and he says, Dr. Leiberg has made impressive improvements to this, and he describes the buildings, and you can see where he proofs it out. You can see what he's got on it, and you can go visit the sites. It's very easy because you can just follow the ornamental fruit trees and again, the sports of them and see. If you drive out to Eucalyptus Point, which again used to be Leiberg Point, used to be Blackwell Point, there's a big playground and picnic area, and there are these big concrete rings. Those were the sewage system for the naval station in the World War II. And those were put on top of the Leiberg's orchard. And their house is on the, one way from it, away from the cliffs, and then the rest of their stuff is there. So that picture of the homestead was made into a postcard, a colorized postcard that just says, this paradise here. And the Leibergs had already left by the time that they did that.
Very nice. Yeah, and that actually brings me, I'm looking forward to work with Lauren as EWU Geology merges with geography
Mm.
And in fall, we start the Department of Geoscience. It's just as a small.
And that's what to me, that's what Leiberg's story is. Geology and geography are the same thing, and people are included in it. Yep, I totally agree. Let's do it.
So another great person here, Pat Spanzer. Did Leiberg travel alone?
He's a lot like David Douglas and all the early explorers. They sound like they're traveling alone, but they are never traveling alone. He hires a cook often to a camp cook. He hires local guides. He has to take a farm wagon in the places he had them. You have to have local knowledge or you're just out of luck. And he's always doing, it's for anybody who's ever done grant proposals, his proposals each year that he sends back to Coville are some of the greatest thing. I didn't get to use them in the book very much, but he'll write these. After he went to Eastern Oregon the first time, he wrote a proposal for a 4-year trip where he was going to go back and forth and do all these things. He took a 1-ton wagon to a 1-horse wagon through Eastern Washington, but for Oregon, he needed a 2-horse wagon. I mean, he just has it down to the detail. And at the end of the year, he'll write a list of things that he got from the department and how he has to send them back and how much they're worth. He's quite a bookkeeper, strangely enough. He's really quite a bookkeeper. And that gives you clues and allows you to see how he's doing it. And again, he's not alone. You can't do this stuff alone. And it makes you think of Brett's. We just think of Harlan Brett's by himself, but he probably had he had students and high school teachers and people coming along with him, helping him out.
You can't forget the grad students.
That's right. That's right.
So there's a couple of questions here that they come in with Steve as well about the moss. So I guess the first one is, can you talk about his studies of the moss and how they affected his research? You mentioned it early on when you were talking about the moss, and then it sort of went to trees. Okay, so
Elizabeth Britton is a bryologist, which is ferns and mosses and liverworts. And it's a specialty thing. I have many botanist friends from working on David Douglas and other projects, and most of them said, mosses, man, I can't deal with mosses. And I give them to this person. So I went and talked to some other bryologists. They're totally amazing, but the language and the sexual parts that do the reproduction are very different. So again, in geology, you learn a vocabulary that allows you to speak to other geologists and understand them. In botany, it's the same thing. Mosses are sort of a separate universe. And there's very few people that I met that did both. A few, but very few. And I'd spent a whole day at the National Herbarium in Washington. I had a great contact in the keeper of the herbarium, and he was going to show me these Leiberg specimens. And I asked him where his mosses were, and he had no idea. He said, I don't have any mosses. But there's a woman here from British Columbia who's doing who's doing a postdoc in some kind of moss things. Let's go find her. So we went and found her. She was a student of Nancy Turner, who's an ethnobotanist, a much-loved ethnobotanist at UV Vic. And I went around with her for a couple hours, and all we did was she explained, well, the big thing that you can do is mosses are very fragile, and you get up in the morning and you fold up all these envelopes to put them in because they get damaged if you don't do that. And I have my ideas about what they are. So we went and found some of Leiberg's the type specimens that he did of the mosses that are named after him. And she looked at him and said that he was a pretty good folder of envelopes. So I got that far in mosses. and there's a wonderful moss biologist in Idaho out of Moscow, Karen Gray, who worked on the Clearwater. And I've been out with her. She teaches me things, but I am less than an infant in the bryology world, except I have a lot more appreciation for people who do them. And when Leiberg does something like the long, hairy ones hanging off the rocks, you can see why he went crazy. Or the thousands of logs stuck in old channels of the Clark Fork Delta. That drives me crazy. That just drives me out of my mind thinking about that. And the picture that I showed for that, I think I can get back to that. This is taken by the Idaho State people who are doing restoration of the Clark Fork Delta, trying to put it back like it was in some fashion. The Corps made the big log yard to try to catch driftwood and all that. And it's a whole universe by itself. And Leiberg spent a lot of time in there. And David Thompson has a map with a lot of the little curlicues in it when it was formed in geologic time rather than in, what can we take apart this week kind of time. And mosses are a big part of that story.
Nice. And that kind of goes in the next question, was actually what I wrote down, one of my notes here as well. But I'll give Steve the credit because he's much smarter than I am. Is these moss-covered trees that you just mentioned as well up in the tributaries. Do you know if Brett's knew any about that? These sort of leftover trees up in the tributaries that were covered.
I do not. I'd like to. One of the things I'd like to do, but haven't gotten around to, is marry some of Leiberg's information with more of the nuts and bolts of Brett's putting together his world. But in my understanding, I think of him out in Eastern Washington more putting it together, and not really getting on to Glacial Lake Missoula until later. And Leiberg goes to great lengths to talk to Britain, saying the Eastern Washington, man, they're terrible for mosses. It's just too dry. And not knowing that these lithosols now, that's the lichens and mosses on the lithosols that grow those biscuit roots. That's a huge area of study for botanical people. He didn't really get to it much because he didn't get there till they were all dried up and they're invisible. If he'd gotten there on one of these days like we're having now where it snows and then gets above freezing in the day and they just all light up. You see these, you go down to Turnbull or Fish Trap into the lithosols and they're just completely lush and look like sponges. That's when you go find the mosses and can really identify them. So there's just a lot to this, both in time, in the yearly cycle and in the geologic long cycles, short cycles and long cycles. You have to put them all together. And Bress was really terrific at that. So I'd like to kind of see what connections I could make between what he was doing and what John Leiberg was doing.
I think that's a wonderful enterprise. You should.
I wish I knew enough to do it yet.
Well, yeah, that's a great thing. As we get this Department of Geosciences,
you'll have graduate students that will have their specific strengths that you can put together a team that could do something like that. Yes.
And then you could be the only person that's recorded is actually doing it all by yourself. So when Leiberg, the next question from Martha Nichols in Newport is, when Leiberg was in the area of Heppner, Oregon, did he have any interest in the fossils of the John Day?
Okay. So, hey, Martha, it's good to hear from you. So again, this is not happening in a vacuum. The Biological Survey in DC is sending people out all the time, and the head wildlife guy is C.H. Merriam, who's a big time name. And Leiberg gets addicted to ground squirrels, which are a lot of in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, and different species. And he's always shooting them and trying to get them to Merriam. And he describes somebody is going up to the John Day from Stanford. Stanford University is sending an expedition up because they're all into fossils because of Jordan is the president of it. And he wants to get up with them. He wants to keep the fossils that he gets. He has all these stipulations that he talks to Colville about and everything. And then he gets out there. He has no time for fossils. The plants are a whole world that he can't even get out. He can't even get unstuck from the mud that he's in coming out of Heppner to get into the John Day. But again, if you retrace his routes and see how he cut through the big geologic sections, the Blue Mountains and then the basalt, the lava plains, and then the basin and range that he gets into down in the Klamath country. I think his mind is just blown so much that he doesn't have a whole lot of time for fossils. He probably saw them, but he does not mention them. And there's the letters from 1896. Colville received a whole packet of letters and gave them to Gifford Pinchot so that Gifford Pinchot could see what kind of mind Leiberg have. And we haven't found those letters yet. So I'm dying to find them, just to find out one of those very things, because everybody's into the John Day that's ever been there. And how could you not want to do things? But again, he has a job. He's got to make a plant list. He's got to climb up every mountain, and the fossils are down.
That is a huge job. Wow, that whole the correlating basin right there. Wow, yeah. So we have a whole bunch of thank yous from all sorts of people, all wonderful people. Yeah, too. The great talk. So the last question I see here real quick was, did you find or were you able to interview any of Leiberg's descendants?
The soap opera part of this is more fun than any of it. And there's his son Bernard. There's different ways to say it, but he had some mental problems. Now we might say that he had multiple personality disorder. Then he had, at that time, there were, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was a big interest in amnesia. There were all these cases of people who, woke up one day and they were living with a family and realized they had just left another family a year ago, but forgot about them, things like that. And that happened to Bernard. He did get married. He did have a kid, but we tracked them. And Ferguson, a great friend from Hope, helped us track all them, but they've all passed away. We did find a great niece of Carrie had a sister who lived in the Bay Area. After John died, she was really sharp financially and ended up buying a house that is still a historic site in Oakland on 19th Avenue. And she lived in this big house, and this great niece who was 99 when we interviewed her remembered going there as a child and told us some things about Carrie when Carrie was a much older woman. And they're totally fascinating. They're in the book. They're totally bizarre and fascinating, and helped a lot to try to flesh Carrie out. But again, it's not the Carrie who was only woman railroad surgeon in North America for a while, or the one who was running for Congress in 1900 before Washington even had women's suffrage, or the one that was running the chickens on the homestead when the land surveyors came by. So I wish I could say we might be able to find some interview and do it, but we were so lucky to get this one. Her mind was just very sharp, and she told us some really great things. I don't think there's much more to get there. If we did have somebody alive, John had 2 sons that he disowned and sued him, and we can't find any relatives of them, but they never saw him growing up. So it's hard. It's hard to, again, a lot of things have to fall right to write a biography of somebody that's complete. So I just decided to write an incomplete one.
Well, I am impressed, Jack. This is great. Yeah. So again, it's the people that asked this: the Dreamer and the Doctor.
I can put it up.
Okay. Yeah. And then we have, and there's a link to Jack Nisbet's website that talks about it too on the invite. If you are interested in coming to more talks with the Columbia Basin, EWU Geology, please email me. I'm Chad Pritchard. Kind of do both the Department of Geology and Columbia Basin. Please also consider, donating to your local geology program so that we can help out folks like Jack Nisbet and everybody else in the community with stormwater issues and historical, things. I would like to, again, yes, thank you very much, Jack. It has been a wonderful talk. That was great. And again, it's just a pleasure to know you. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you. And we will hopefully have you back someday.
All right. Thanks a lot, Chad. We'll see you.